They said the baby was born under a bad moon. The neighbors whispered it like a curse, as if the child herself carried something unnatural, something that should have stayed buried in the bloodline that made her. The mother, a quiet young woman named Clara Mae, never spoke about who the father was. Not to her friends, not to her pastor, not even to her dying mother who begged to know before she passed. But in that small town of Tennessee in 1947, secrets didn't stay buried long. Especially not the kind that ran through blood, thick, dark, and twisted like the roots beneath the old oak tree where Clara used to play as a child. Hello everyone, before we start make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Alright, now let's go back to the story. People saw things they shouldn't have. A shadow slipping into Clara's window late at night. A man who looked too much like her. Same eyes, same jawline, same sorrow that clung to him like a ghost. And when the baby was born, people said she looked like him too. Too much like him. There was no father listed on the birth certificate. Just Clara's name scrawled in trembling ink. And beneath it, a silence so heavy that it smothered the whole town. The doctor who delivered the child quit his practice the next month. The nurse moved away. And Clara, she stayed, alone, in that creaking farmhouse filled with family portraits and a baby who bore the family's curse in her tiny, perfect face. Years later, when the truth finally came out, the locals would call it the sin of the blood. But back then, all they knew was that something was deeply wrong. Not with the baby, not even with Clara, but with the bloodline itself. A family so isolated, so self-contained, that no outsider ever truly knew where one generation ended and the next began. The tragedy wasn't in what Clara did. It was in what she didn't know. Because what she called love, what she thought was affection, had been something far darker, something taught to her shaped by years of quiet manipulation and masked as family loyalty. By the time she understood the truth, it was too late. The child had already been born, and the blood had already repeated itself. Some stories aren't about monsters that come from the woods. They're about the monsters that grow up inside the home, wearing familiar faces, whispering promises in the dark, and calling it love. Clara Mae's family lived deep in the hills, on land that never changed hands. The Harwicks had owned that soil since before the Civil War, passing it down from father to son, generation after generation, as if it were sacred. Outsiders weren't welcome. Even the mailman left letters at the gate, afraid to drive past the rusted fence where dogs barked and the trees seemed to lean inward like they were keeping watch. Clara grew up believing her world began and ended on that land. Her mother rarely spoke, her eyes always fixed somewhere far away. Her father, Elijah Harwick, was a man of few words but a heavy presence, one that filled every room he entered. To Clara, he was both protector and judge, the kind of man who quoted scripture with one hand on the Bible and the other on a belt. There were no friends, no visitors. Her schooling ended by 12, her lessons replaced by household duties and long hours tending to the farm. And when the nights grew long and the wind carried strange sounds through the valley, she would lie awake in her bed, listening to the creaks of the old house and wondering what kind of secrets it kept behind its walls. Her mother used to tell her, "Blood is all that matters, Clara Mae, blood is what God gave us. Never trust what's outside it." At the time, Clara thought it was just a lesson about loyalty. But later, she would realize it was something far darker, a warning passed down through generations who had already crossed the line too many times to turn back. The Harwicks didn't marry outsiders. They married cousins. Sometimes even closer than that. It was a tradition dressed up as pride, a way to keep the line pure. But purity has a strange way of curdling when it's trapped in the same body too long. By the time Clara turned 17, her world had already begun to shrink. The fences grew higher, the visits to town rarer, and the man she trusted most, the one who said she was his precious girl, began to visit her room at night under the pretense of checking the locks, making sure she was safe. He would whisper, "You're my blood, Clara, my only one," and she would nod, because that was what good daughters did. She didn't know that love could have limits. She didn't know that blood could lie, because when she found out who her baby's father really was, it wasn't a rumor. It was a revelation that shattered her world into silence. The night Clara conceived the child, the moon was low and swollen, a red glow spilling over the hills like a wound. The house was quiet except for the sound of the wind pressing against the window panes and the floorboards groaning under slow, deliberate footsteps. Clara was half asleep when the door opened. She thought it was a dream like so many others before. Dreams where she couldn't move, couldn't speak, but felt a weight pressing down on her. A warmth she didn't ask for, wrapped in a voice that told her it was love. Her father told her that no man would ever understand her like he did. He said the outside world was cruel, that people would use her, break her, ruin the family name. "You're safer here," he'd whisper. "You're meant to be mine, like your mama was to her daddy before her." Those words didn't make sense until much later, when Clara began to see patterns in the family photographs. The faces didn't just resemble each other, they mirrored. The same eyes, the same jaw, the same crooked smile that carried down the line like an inheritance nobody asked for. When Clara realized she was pregnant, she told no one. Her mother had long since disappeared into silence, her eyes blank and glassy, like someone who had seen too much and survived too little. The rest of the family just carried on, pretending nothing was wrong, pretending not to see the swelling of her belly or the tears she tried to hide during supper. The birth took place in the same bedroom where she'd been born. The midwife was her aunt, a woman who'd delivered every Harwick child for 3 generations. She never asked a single question, just wiped her hands on a cloth, cut the cord, and said, "Another one for the line." The baby came out small, pale and silent. For a moment, Clara thought she wasn't breathing, but then a cry, soft, trembling, alive. Clara held her close, staring into those familiar eyes and feeling something break inside her. She didn't see her father again for days. When he finally came into her room, he stood over the cradle and smiled that same strange smile. "You've done well," he said. "She's perfect, just like you." In that moment, Clara realized she hadn't given birth to a daughter. She'd given birth to the next link in the family chain, forged from the same twisted metal that had bound them all for generations. The years that followed blurred together like a fever dream. Clara raised her daughter, little Ruth, in the same suffocating silence she'd been raised in. The walls of the Harwick house held their secrets tight, and the land around it seemed to swallow sound itself. Even the birds rarely sang near the property anymore. Ruth was a quiet child, watchful, her eyes too old for her face. She didn't cry much. She just stared at the photographs on the wall, at the way her grandfather watched her, at the way her mother flinched whenever he entered the room. Elijah Harwick had grown older, slower, but not weaker. His voice still carried authority. His will still ruled every decision. He called Ruth his little miracle. Sometimes he'd sit her on his knee and tell her stories about the family, how the Harwicks were chosen, how outsiders brought ruin, how the blood must remain untouched. Ruth didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the same tone her mother once believed meant protection. Clara, trapped in her own guilt and fear, tried to protect her child in small, desperate ways. She'd lock the bedroom door at night. She'd take long walks with Ruth to the edge of the property, standing by the fence and staring out at the world she'd never known, a world that suddenly looked like salvation. But she never crossed that line. She didn't know how. The idea of leaving terrified her more than staying. That's what years of control do. They make the cage feel safer than the air outside it. One evening when Ruth was about 6, she asked Clara a question that made her blood run cold. "Mama," she said softly, "why does Grandpa say I'm special like you?" Clara froze. The words hit her like a slap. She looked into her daughter's eyes and saw herself, not just her reflection, but her past. The same innocence, the same danger, the same pattern waiting to repeat. That night she stayed awake, listening for footsteps. Every creak in the floorboards made her heart stop. Every shadow felt alive. She realized that if she didn't find a way out, history would consume them both. The Harwick curse wasn't a ghost story. It was a cycle, and the only way to break a cycle that runs in the blood is to spill it. Clara started planning in secret. It began with small things, packing away a few clothes, hiding coins beneath the floorboard, memorizing the rhythm of Elijah's footsteps at night. Every move had to be careful, deliberate, invisible. She knew one mistake could cost her and Ruth everything. The nearest town was 12 miles away, a journey she could make only under cover of darkness. But before she could flee, she needed to find a moment when Elijah wouldn't notice. He watched everything. Even the sound of a door latch at night could wake him. The house had eyes, and every wall, every creak felt like it was reporting back to him. One afternoon, Clara found an old photograph in a drawer. It was faded, from long before she was born. Elijah as a young man, standing beside a woman who looked almost exactly like Clara. The handwriting on the back said, "Elijah and his sister, June 1918. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. That was the year her grandmother disappeared. Family stories claimed she'd run off to the city. But Clara understood now. She hadn't left. She'd been erased. That night, Clara made her decision. She whispered to Ruth, "We're going on a trip tomorrow, baby. Somewhere safe." Ruth didn't ask questions. She only nodded, her eyes wide and knowing. But safety is a fragile dream when you're born into a curse. As the moon rose, Clara packed the last of their things and waited for Elijah to fall asleep. But he didn't. His door creaked open and she heard his voice, low and heavy, from the hallway. "You think you can take what's mine and run," he said. The lantern light flickered, casting his shadow long across the wall. Clara stood between him and the child. For the first time in her life she didn't tremble. "She's not yours," she said. "She never was." Elijah's expression changed, not anger, not surprise, but pity. "You don't understand, Clara. She is mine, just like you were mine, just like my mother before me." It was then Clara realized it wasn't just him. It was the whole bloodline, an inheritance of madness dressed in tradition, sanctified by fear. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because what Clara did next, no one in Harwick history had ever dared before. The next morning, the valley was wrapped in fog. Clara didn't sleep. She sat in the corner of the room, holding Ruth close, listening to the ticking of the clock that seemed louder than her own heartbeat. When the first light came through the curtains, she knew what she had to do. She waited until Elijah went to the barn. His habits were predictable. He always checked the animals before breakfast, always carried the same lantern. Clara took Ruth's hand, and for the first time, they stepped past the front gate. The gravel crunched beneath their feet like a sound forbidden for generations. But freedom has a way of waking monsters. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, Clara heard shouting from the house. Elijah's voice carried across the fog, calling her name, not in rage, but in that terrible, coaxing tone she remembered from childhood. "Clara Mae, you can't leave! You'll die out there, girl! The world ain't made for our kind!" She didn't look back. She couldn't. Ruth stumbled beside her, clutching a small, stuffed rabbit. They made it to the old bridge by the creek before the sound of boots on gravel grew closer. Elijah was faster than she remembered. His lantern light cut through the fog, and soon he was standing on the bridge behind them. "You'd break your mother's heart," he said softly, "just like she broke mine." The Clara turned to face him, her face pale, her eyes wild. "You broke everything, Daddy." He took a step closer. "You don't understand. It's not sin, it's destiny. Our blood is all we have. Without it, we're nothing." Something snapped inside her. Years of fear, shame, and silence boiled into something sharp and cold. She grabbed the lantern from his hand and threw it over the bridge railing. It shattered against the rocks below, the flame flaring bright before dying out in the water. Elijah lunged. Clara pushed. There was a cry, not of pain, but of shock. Then the old wood gave way beneath them, and the world vanished in a rush of light water and splintered sound. When the sun rose again, only one figure climbed from the creek, soaked, shaking, and silent. Ruth. She wandered back to the house alone. By the time the neighbors found Ruth, she was standing barefoot on the porch of the Harwick house, her dress soaked and torn, her eyes blank like a porcelain doll's. The sheriff asked her what happened, but she said nothing, just pointed toward the woods, where the fog still hung heavy over the creek. They searched for 2 days. They found Elijah's body first, caught against a fallen branch downstream. His neck was broken. The current had carried him 1/2 mile from the bridge. They never found Clara. Some said the river took her. Others whispered that she'd walked away into the trees and never looked back. Ruth was sent to live with distant relatives in another county. But people said she never really left the Harwick house, not in her mind. At night, she would sit by the window and hum a song no one recognized, a melody that made the dogs outside whimper and the candles flicker. Years passed, and Ruth grew into a woman who looked hauntingly like her mother. The same soft voice, the same dark eyes that seemed to remember everything. She rarely spoke of her family, but she kept one photograph in a wooden box under her bed, a picture of Elijah and Clara together, smiling stiffly beside the farmhouse. When asked about it, Ruth would say, "That's the house where love and blood were the same thing." People thought she was being poetic. But there was something in her tone that made them uneasy, something too calm, like a person who had made peace with a horror no one else could understand. And then, in the spring of 1968, she disappeared, just like her mother. The authorities said she ran off to the city, but the locals, they knew better. Some swore they saw a lantern moving through the woods late that night, the same glow that once marked Elijah's nightly rounds. Others claimed they heard a baby crying in the distance, though there were no children for miles. The Harwick property fell into ruin after that, the house collapsing in on itself, the trees swallowing the fields. But people still avoid that stretch of land. They say the soil there feels wrong, heavy, as if it remembers. And if you walk too close to the creek, you might hear it too. A woman's voice, faint and hollow, whispering through the mist, "Blood is all that matters." Decades passed, but the legend of the Harwick family never truly died. Locals still whispered about the curse, about the line that was too pure to survive. Children dared each other to sneak onto the property, but most turned back before they reached the old gate. Those who didn't, well, they came back different, quiet, distant. In 1993, the land was finally sold at auction. A developer planned to build new homes there, flattening what was left of the Harwick farmhouse. But when the bulldozers broke ground, they found something beneath the roots of the old oak, a small box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were three things: a silver locket with the initials CMH, a faded photograph of Clara holding a baby, and a letter written in her trembling hand. It was never made public, but a worker who saw it said the letter began with one line: "To whoever finds this, you should have left us buried." After that, the project stalled. Investors pulled out. The land was left untouched again, and within a few years, nature reclaimed it entirely. The fences rotted, the fields grew thick with weeds, and the Harwick house, or what was left of it, sank deeper into the soil. But evil doesn't need walls to survive. It lives in memory, in stories told around campfires, in the unease that creeps up when you hear your family name whispered just right. A journalist once tried to track Ruth's lineage in the early 2000s. He found something strange: birth certificates that didn't match, marriage records that seemed fabricated, a whole branch of descendants hidden under false names. People who looked eerily alike, scattered across the South. Some of them even carried the name Harwick again, though none claimed to be related. He published one article about it before vanishing from the public eye. His last email, sent to his editor at midnight, read, "It's not over. The bloodline's still alive." Maybe that's why no one goes near the Harwick land anymore. Not because they fear the ghosts, but because some part of them knows the story isn't finished. Somewhere out there, that blood still runs, still chooses, still remembers, and maybe it's waiting. Every town has its dark corners, places that hold more silence than they should. But the Harwick story isn't just a tale about one family's sin. It's a mirror, reflecting something older, something buried deep in the American soil itself. The idea of pure blood, it didn't start with the Harwicks. It came over with settlers who believed they were chosen, destined to build a perfect lineage untouched by outsiders. Generation after generation, that belief twisted into something monstrous. It was preached from pulpits, written into family Bibles, and justified with words like honor and legacy. Clara Mae wasn't the first woman trapped by that lie. Across the country, stories like hers were quietly erased. Daughters who disappeared, sons who bore strange resemblances, family trees that folded in on themselves like dying flowers. These weren't isolated tragedies, they were patterns. Repeated, denied, and buried. And America learned how to look away, how to pretend those families were strange, private, old-fashioned. It was easier than asking what happened behind those locked farmhouse doors. Easier than admitting that sometimes evil doesn't wear a mask. It wears a last name. The Harwicks were simply a symptom of something larger, the rot that grows when pride becomes worship, when loyalty turns into possession. They called it tradition. They called it blood. But what it really was fear. Fear of outsiders. Fear of shame. Fear of facing the truth that maybe the curse wasn't supernatural at all. Maybe it was human. There's an old saying in the valley now: don't dig where the Harwicks lived. The ground remembers. And maybe it does. Maybe every drop of rain that falls there carries the memory of what happened. The love that became control, the family that became a cage. And if you stand there long enough, by the creek where Clara vanished, you might hear it, the echo of a child's laugh, the rustle of a woman's dress, and beneath it all, a whisper that sounds almost like a warning. Blood always calls home. Because no matter how far you run from a past like that, it always finds a way to call you back. Some say the Harwick curse ended that night by the creek. Others say it never did. That blood doesn't just stop remembering. It seeps into everything: the soil, the water, the names that change but never truly disappear. And maybe that's the real horror. Not ghosts, not curses, but memory itself. When historians look back on families like the Harwicks, they write them off as footnotes, isolated incidents, unverified legends. But the truth is, stories like this survive for a reason. They warn us. They show us how easily love can rot when it's built on control, how a lie told in the name of family can stretch across centuries. Clara Mae's story isn't one of monsters, not the kind that hide under beds or stalk through forests. It's about the monsters that live in hearts, the ones that learn to disguise harm as devotion. It's about how evil can be inherited not through blood itself, but through silence. The things people refuse to speak of because it's easier to keep pretending it never happened. Ruth grew up believing her mother drowned that night. But sometimes, when she closed her eyes, She said she could still feel Clara's arms around her, guiding her through the dark. Some locals believe Ruth did escape, that she changed her name and started again somewhere new. Others believe she went back, that she couldn't resist the pull of her own blood, that she became what she was always meant to be. The Harwick house no longer stands. The last of its stones were taken by time and rain. But if you visit the valley on a still night when the fog hangs low and the wind is soft, you might see a single light glowing near the creek. Some say it's just swamp gas. Others swear it's Clara still searching for a place to rest, still trying to warn anyone who wanders too close. Whatever the truth is, one thing remains certain. The past never stays buried, not in America, not in the old families who built their lives on secrets, and not in the bloodlines that mistook possession for love. Because in the end, the Harwicks weren't cursed by the devil. They were cursed by each other. And maybe, just maybe, that's the oldest curse of all.